In the gleaming corridors of St. Catherine's Medical Center in Charleston, South Carolina, where the wealthy receive world-class care and the staff maintains impeccable credentials, no one expected that the answer to an impossible medical crisis would come from the quietest person in the building. This is the story of how a 62-year-old hospital janitor named Marcus Wellington used knowledge born from personal tragedy to save a life that every doctor had given up on, and how that single moment of courage changed not just one family, but revealed the invisible wisdom that walks among us every day, dismissed by those who measure worth only in degrees and bank accounts. It's a testament to the truth that expertise comes in many forms, that grief can transform into purpose, and that sometimes the most profound acts of healing happen in the spaces between protocol and compassion, performed by hands that society overlooks but heaven notices. The emergency room of St. Catherine's Medical Center erupted into controlled chaos at 2:47 a.m. when Sheikh Rashid Al-Mahmoud burst through the automatic doors carrying his 3-month-old daughter Layla, her tiny body limp and unresponsive in his arms. His traditional white kandura was disheveled, his gutra sliding from his head as he ran, his normally composed face twisted with a father's raw terror. "Please, my daughter!" She stopped breathing. "Please help her!" His voice, usually measured and commanding in boardroom negotiations across 3 continents, now cracked with desperation. The triage nurse took one look at the infant's blue-tinged lips and immediately called for the pediatric emergency team. Within seconds, the baby was whisked away to Trauma Bay 3, leaving Rashid standing alone in the bright fluorescent light, his hands still shaped as if holding his daughter, his $40,000 Patek Philippe watch forgotten as time itself seemed to stop. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the hospital's chief of pediatric emergency medicine, arrived within minutes, her 25 years of experience evident in her quick assessment and calm commands to her team. She worked with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, establishing an IV line, preparing intubation equipment, while Rashid watched through the glass window, his hands pressed against the cold surface as if he could will his strength into his daughter's tiny body. "Sats are dropping. We're at 72%. Prepare for intubation," Dr. Morrison called out, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. The respiratory therapist moved in with the pediatric intubation kit, but after 2 attempts, the doctor's composed expression began to show cracks of concern. "The airway is swelling shut. I can't visualize the cords. We need to try a smaller tube." But the second tube failed as well, and then the third. Rashid watched in horror as the monitor showed his daughter's oxygen levels continuing to plummet. Marcus Wellington had been mopping the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, as he did every night during his 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift when the emergency began. At 62 years old, Marcus had worked at St. Catherine's for 18 years. Arriving at this position after his previous life had been shattered by tragedy. He was nearly invisible to most of the medical staff, just another night shift worker in navy blue scrubs, pushing his mop bucket, emptying trash cans, and sanitizing surfaces while doctors and nurses saved lives. But Marcus noticed everything. From his position outside the trauma bay, he could see the monitor readings, could hear Dr. Morrison's increasingly urgent commands, could see the way the medical team's movements were becoming more frantic rather than more focused. And he recognized something in the baby's presentation, something that made his heart begin to race with a terrible, familiar recognition. His hands tightened on the mop handle as a memory he'd tried to bury for 30 years suddenly surged forward with crystalline clarity. The overhead intercom suddenly crackled to life. "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. More staff rushed to respond. Another attending physician, 2 more nurses, the anesthesiologist on call. Through the glass, Rashid could see his daughter's tiny chest barely moving, could see the tangle of tubes and monitors surrounding her, could see Dr. Morrison's face set in grim concentration as she attempted yet another procedure. "I'm going to try a needle cricothyrotomy," she announced to her team. It's our only option at this point. Her airway is completely obstructed. The procedure, creating an emergency airway through the cricothyroid membrane, was a last resort, rarely performed on infants due to the incredibly small anatomy and high risk of complications. Rashid felt his knees weaken as he understood what last resort truly meant. His wife, Samira, was thousands of miles away in Dubai, believing their daughter was simply accompanying him on a business trip to Charleston. How could he call her and say their baby girl was dying? Marcus stepped away from his mop bucket, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the terrible weight of a decision he knew he had to make. Through the trauma bay window, he could see the team preparing for the cricothyrotomy, could see Dr. Morrison's hands moving with desperate precision, could see the baby's oxygen saturation now reading 58%, a number that meant brain damage was already becoming likely, that death was a real and imminent possibility. And he knew, with the certainty born from his own devastating past, that they were about to do the wrong thing. The cricothyrotomy wouldn't work. He'd seen this exact presentation before, 30 years ago, in another hospital with another tiny patient who had shared his blood, and he'd watched, helpless and ignorant then, as the doctors tried the same interventions that were being attempted now. He'd watched them fail. He'd buried a daughter because of it. "Sir, you can't be here right now," a young nurse said, noticing Marcus standing motionless near the trauma bay door, his face ashen. "You need to clear the area during a code." But Marcus didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the monitor, on the baby's vital signs that were telling him a story the doctors weren't reading correctly. "Please, sir," the nurse began again, reaching for his arm, but Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and urgent. "That baby doesn't need a cricothyrotomy. She has laryngeal papillomatosis with acute obstruction. You need to do a direct laryngoscopy with forceps removal of the papillomas, or you need to establish a surgical airway below the obstruction. If Dr. Morrison punctures the cricothyroid membrane, she's going to puncture right into a papilloma cluster, cause massive bleeding, and the baby will die." The nurse stared at him in shock, her hand frozen on his arm. "How could you possibly? You're a janitor. You need to leave now, or I'll call security." But Rashid, standing just a few feet away, had heard every word Marcus said. The sheikh turned sharply, his dark eyes, red from crying but still sharp with the intelligence that had built a business empire, fixed on the older man in the navy scrubs. "What did you say about my daughter?" His voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Marcus met his gaze directly, seeing past the expensive watch and traditional dress to the terror of a father who would do anything to save his child. "I said your daughter has a condition called laryngeal papillomatosis, growths in her throat caused by HPV. They're blocking her airway. The swelling and obstruction pattern, the way her oxygen levels are dropping despite. Clear lungs on the monitor. I've seen this before. The procedure they're about to do will kill her." His voice was steady now, carrying the weight of terrible experience. "You need to stop them and demand a surgical airway or direct removal of the obstruction. Architected narrative tension and romantic subplot development for medical crisis storyline." The young nurse looked horrified. "Sir, you cannot listen to the janitor. He has no medical training." But Rashid was already pushing through the trauma bay door, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Stop! Stop the procedure!" His voice thundered through the small room, causing every head to turn. Dr. Morrison looked up from where she was positioning the needle, her expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Sheikh Al-Mahmoud, you cannot be in here during a medical procedure. I understand you're frightened, but you must let us—" Rashid cut her off with a sharp gesture. "The man outside says my daughter has laryngeal papillomatosis. He says the procedure you're about to do will kill her. He says you need to do something else, a surgical airway or direct removal." The room fell into shocked silence. Dr. Morrison's face flushed with anger. "The janitor? You're taking medical advice from our janitor? Sheikh Al-Mahmoud, with all due respect, your daughter is dying, and every second we waste, then explain to me why he's wrong." Rashid interrupted, his voice deadly calm despite the terror churning in his gut. Explain to me why a man I've never met would risk his job to stop you unless he believed he was right. Explain why he knew the exact term for a medical condition and the exact procedures needed to treat it. He moved to stand between Dr. Morrison and the baby, his body language making it clear he would physically intervene if necessary. You have 30 seconds to convince me, doctor. My daughter's oxygen is at 54%. If you cannot tell me with certainty that he's wrong and you're right, then you will do what he suggested, or I will have you removed from this hospital so fast you'll think Allah himself reached down and plucked you out. The threat was real and backed by the kind of wealth that could make problems or people disappear. Dr. Morrison had treated enough wealthy patients to know when someone had the power to follow through on such threats. But more than that, something in the Sheikh's words made her pause. Why would a janitor risk everything unless he truly believed he was right? Dr. Morrison's hand lowered slowly from the baby's neck. She looked at the monitor, at the baby's vital signs, at the rapid swelling they'd been unable to control. Then she looked toward the trauma bay window where Marcus still stood, his face grave but steady. Bring him in, she said quietly, her professional pride warring with the reality that this child was about to die under her care. If he's wrong, it's on your head, Sheikh Al-Mahmoud, but if there's even a chance— She didn't finish the sentence. The anesthesiologist stepped aside as Rashid opened the door and gestured for Marcus to enter. The janitor walked into the trauma bay with his shoulders squared, looking at none of the doctors or nurses whose shocked faces tracked his movement. His eyes went straight to the baby, to little Layla, whose life hung by a thread so thin it was nearly invisible. Tell me what you see, Dr. Morrison commanded, her voice still carrying authority, but now edged with desperate hope. Marcus moved to the bedside, his calloused hands hovering over the baby without touching. He knew better than to contaminate the sterile field. Look at the monitor. Her oxygen saturation drops aren't gradual. They're stepping down in sharp declines. That's not swelling from an allergic reaction or infection. That's mechanical obstruction from growths that shift position as she tries to breathe. See how her chest retracts aren't even. There's more retraction on the right side. That suggests the obstruction is worse on the right vocal cord. The stridor you heard earlier, it was both inspiratory and expiratory, which means the obstruction is in the glottis, not above or below it. He spoke with quiet confidence, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned knowledge. Laryngeal papillomatosis presents most commonly in children under 3. It's caused by HPV type 6 and 11, usually. Transmitted during birth, the papillomas grow rapidly and can completely obstruct the airway. Dr. Morrison stared at him, her mind racing. Everything he was saying aligned with the clinical picture, but it was so rare. She'd only seen 2 cases in her entire career, and both had been older children with clear voice changes that made the diagnosis obvious. How do you know all this? She demanded. Who are you, really? Marcus finally met her eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. A grief so old and deep it had become part of his foundation. I'm exactly who you think I am, doctor. I'm a janitor at this hospital. I clean your floors and empty your trash. But 30 years ago, I was an EMT in Detroit. And 30 years ago, I had a baby daughter named Jasmine, who died because she had laryngeal papillomatosis. And we didn't figure it out until it was too late. His voice cracked slightly on his daughter's name, the first time he'd spoken it aloud. In years, I watched her die in a hospital room, while doctors tried everything except the one thing that could have saved her. I've spent 30 years reading every medical journal article, every case study, every research paper on that condition. I know more about laryngeal papillomatosis than anyone in this hospital. And I'm telling you, if you don't act right now, this baby will die the same way my Jasmine did. The trauma bay fell silent, except for the insistent beeping of monitors, and the baby's labored attempts to breathe. Dr. Morrison made a decision that would either save her career or end it. Dr. Samuel Chen, she called to the ENT surgeon who had responded to the code. Scrub in. We're doing an emergency direct laryngoscopy with instrument removal. Marcus, she used his name deliberately, acknowledging him as a person rather than just a janitor. Talk us through what you know. Every detail. Marcus nodded, relief washing over him so strongly his knees nearly buckled. You'll need the smallest laryngoscope blade you have. The papillomas will be clustered primarily on the right true vocal cord, probably extending to the anterior commissure. They'll be white or pink, pedunculated, attached by small stalks. Don't try to remove them all at once. Take the largest one first to establish some airway, then work systematically. If you cause bleeding, it'll make visualization impossible and you'll lose her. Use gentle traction with microscissors or microdebrider, not forceps. Forceps will crush the tissue and cause more bleeding. 15 minutes later, with Marcus standing just behind the surgical team providing guidance born from his exhaustive self-education and terrible experience, Dr. Chen carefully maneuvered the laryngoscope into position. The video monitor showed what the scope was seeing, and everyone in the room inhaled sharply. There, exactly as Marcus had described, were multiple white papillomatous growths covering the baby's right vocal cord and extending across the glottis, leaving only the tiniest space for air to pass through. "My God," Dr. Morrison whispered. He was right. He was completely right. The ENT surgeon worked with microscopic precision, using tiny instruments to carefully remove the largest papilloma first. As it came free, the baby's oxygen saturation immediately jumped from 51% to 63%. More careful work followed, each papilloma removed, opening the airway a little more, until finally little Layla drew in a deep, clear breath, her oxygen climbing rapidly, 70%, 80%, 92%, 98%. The monitor's alarm silenced, replaced by the steady beeping of a normal heart rate and oxygen saturation. Rashid, who had been standing rigid against the wall with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, suddenly collapsed to his knees, his forehead touching the floor in the traditional gesture of prostration and gratitude to Allah. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered prayers in Arabic, thanking God for his daughter's life, for bringing the right person to the right place at the right time, for this miracle that had come from the most unexpected source. When he finally raised his head, his eyes sought Marcus, who was quietly stepping back from the surgical team, retreating to the shadows as if his job was done and he should disappear again, into invisibility. "No," Rashid said firmly, rising to his feet. "You don't get to leave. You saved my daughter's life. Do you understand what that means? You gave me back everything I love in this world." Marcus turned, his face showing exhaustion and old pain, resurfacing from having spoken his daughter's name aloud for the first time in 3 decades. "I'm glad she's okay," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." But Rashid crossed the room in 3 long strides and did something that shocked everyone present. He embraced Marcus, pulling the older man into a tight hug that transcended cultural differences and social class and every boundary that society had constructed between them. "You are more than a janitor," Rashid said fiercely, his voice choked with emotion. "You are a father who turned his grief into knowledge that saved another father's child. You are a man of wisdom and courage. You are my brother, and I am in your debt for the rest of my life." Marcus stood stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the attention, the embrace, the emotion. But then something broke inside him, some wall he'd built 30 years ago when he couldn't save his own daughter, and he returned the embrace, allowing himself to accept that maybe, just maybe, his loss had not been meaningless if it meant this baby girl would live. Dr. Morrison watched the scene with tears in her own eyes, humbled by what had just occurred. She had nearly killed this child with her certainty, her credentials, her unwillingness to consider that expertise might exist outside the formal structures of medical education. "Marcus," she said, her voice unsteady, "I owe you an apology. I owe you more than that. I owe you the acknowledgement that you saved this child's life when I was about to end it. I should have listened. I should have—" She trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Marcus gently extracted himself from Rashid's embrace and turned to face her. "You did listen, Doctor. When it mattered most, you put aside your pride and you listened. That took more courage than most people have. You gave me the chance to make sure another parent doesn't have to bury their child the way I buried mine. That's enough. That's more than enough." News of what happened in Trauma Bay 3 spread through St. Catherine's Medical Center like wildfire. By the time the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m., the story had grown to near mythical proportions. The janitor who saved the billionaire's baby, the diagnosis that stumped the doctors, the man who had spent 30 years preparing for this one moment. The hospital administration was in an uproar, split between those who saw Marcus as a liability who had overstepped his bounds and those who recognized that he had prevented what would have been a catastrophic outcome and probable lawsuit. Dr. Vincent Hargrove, the hospital's chief medical officer, called an emergency, meeting with Dr. Morrison, Dr. Chen, and the hospital's legal team. Meanwhile, Rashid refused to leave the pediatric ICU, where Layla was now stabilized and sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling with clear, unobstructed breaths. And Marcus tried to quietly clock out and go home, only to be stopped by hospital security. "Mr. Wellington, you need to come with us," the security officer said, not unkindly. "There's a situation that needs to be addressed." Marcus followed. Without protest, his heart heavy. He'd known this was coming, the moment when the hospital would have to decide what to do about the janitor who had inserted himself into a medical emergency. He'd violated protocols, exceeded his authority, involved himself in patient care despite having no medical credentials. Even though he'd been right, even though he'd saved a life, the system had rules for a reason. He understood that. He'd accept whatever consequences came. They led him not to a small office, but to the hospital's main conference room, where he found himself facing not just administrators, but also Dr. Morrison, Dr. Chen, and to his surprise, Sheikh Rashid Al-Mahmoud, who had somehow managed to both stay with his daughter and arranged to be present for this meeting. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the table, his expression difficult to read. "Mr. Wellington, do you understand why you're here?" Marcus nodded. "I overstepped. I understand if you need to let me go. I couldn't watch another baby die when I knew what was wrong." The CMO studied him for a long moment. "Tell me about your background, everything. How does a hospital janitor know how to diagnose a rare pediatric condition that even our chief of pediatric emergency medicine didn't recognize?" So Marcus told them. He told them about his daughter Jasmine, born when he was 32 and working as an EMT in Detroit. He told them about the first time she had breathing, difficulties at 3 months old, how they'd been dismissed as croup, then as asthma, then as allergies. He told them about the night when she was 7 months old, that she stopped breathing in her crib, how he'd performed CPR all the way to the hospital, how the doctors had tried everything except considering laryngeal papillomatosis because it was rare, because she didn't fit the typical presentation, because sometimes even doctors fall victim to the belief that common things are common and rare things don't happen. Jasmine died at 8 months old, Marcus continued, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the edge of the conference table. The autopsy showed extensive laryngeal papillomas that had completely obstructed her airway. They told me afterward, after she was gone, that if they'd known, if they'd done a simple laryngoscopy, they could have removed them. She could have lived. After that, he paused, gathering himself. After that, my marriage fell apart. My wife couldn't look at me without seeing the baby we'd lost. I couldn't work as an EMT anymore. Every child's cry sounded like Jasmine. I moved here to Charleston, started over doing the only work I could handle that didn't involve direct patient care, but I couldn't stop reading about her condition. Medical journals, research papers, case studies. I read everything I could find about laryngeal papillomatosis. I needed to understand why she died. I needed to know that if I ever saw those signs again, I would recognize them. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. I know I'm not a doctor. I know I don't have the right to diagnose patients, but I also know I was right, and that baby girl is alive because I spoke up. I'll accept whatever consequences you decide, but I won't apologize for saving her life. Rashid stood abruptly, his traditional kandura freshly changed, his gutra properly arranged, looking every inch the powerful businessman he was. I have something to say, if I may. Dr. Hargrove nodded, and Rashid continued. I have donated extensively to this hospital over the years. My companies have funded your new surgical wing, your pediatric oncology unit, your research facilities. I tell you this not to boast, but to establish that I am invested in this institution's success. He turned to face Marcus directly. This man, Mr. Marcus Wellington, has more practical knowledge of a critical pediatric condition than anyone in this room. He has spent 30 years transforming his grief into expertise, and yet you employ him to clean floors. This is madness. This is a waste of a precious resource. He turned back to Dr. Hargrove. I want to make a proposal. I will fund a new position at this hospital, a pediatric emergency consultant position. Marcus Wellington will be trained, credentialed, and employed to provide specialized knowledge on rare conditions. He will be available to consult on complex cases, and he will be paid appropriately for the expertise he brings. The conference room erupted in surprised murmurs. Dr. Morrison leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Sheikh Al-Mahmoud, while I appreciate your gratitude, we have protocols. Marcus doesn't have a medical degree, and Rashid held up a hand. He has something more valuable than a degree. He has lived experience and self-directed mastery of a specific domain. Your protocols nearly killed my daughter. His knowledge saved her. I'm not suggesting he practice medicine. I'm suggesting he be available as a specialized consultant, supervised by credentialed physicians, providing the kind of pattern recognition and detailed knowledge that comes from intensive focus. Many hospitals employ patient navigators, cultural consultants, and other non-physician experts. Why not a pediatric emergency consultant who specializes in rare conditions? He looked at Dr. Hargrove. I will fund this position for 5 years. If after that time you don't find value in it, I'll withdraw my support. But I believe Mr. Wellington has much to offer, and I believe this hospital would benefit from finding a way to utilize his knowledge within appropriate boundaries. Dr. Hargrove looked at Marcus, who sat in stunned silence. Mr. Wellington, would you be interested in such a position? Marcus's mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged. I never thought and don't know what to say. Yes, I would be honored. If you think I could actually help people, if there's a way to make sure what happened to Jasmine doesn't happen to other children, yes. Dr. Morrison spoke up again, but this time her tone was different, collaborative rather than resistant. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. Marcus should complete a formal education program, maybe a graduate certificate in pediatric healthcare or emergency medicine. We could have him shadow in the pediatric emergency department, attend case conferences, participate in grand rounds. Under supervision, of course, but with his dedication and self-taught knowledge as a foundation, he could become genuinely valuable to the team. She smiled at Marcus, and it was warm and genuine. I'd be honored to be one of his supervisors. I think he has a lot to teach us about the humility to listen to unconventional sources of knowledge. 3 months later, Marcus Wellington walked through the doors of St. Catherine's Medical Center, wearing not navy blue janitorial scrubs, but a white consultation coat with his name embroidered on the pocket, Marcus Wellington, pediatric emergency consultant. Beneath his name was a small embroidered butterfly, a symbol he'd chosen to honor Jasmine, whose name meant a gift from God, and who had, in death, given him a purpose he'd never imagined possible. He was enrolled in an online graduate program through Georgetown University's School of Health Sciences, attended daily rounds in the pediatric emergency department, and had already been consulted on 4 cases in his first month. 2 had been straightforward, adding little to the attending physician's assessments, but 2 had been cases where his extensive knowledge of rare conditions had provided critical differential diagnoses that changed patient outcomes. He was beginning to believe that maybe his life, which had felt stuck in grief for 3 decades, was finally moving forward again. Rashid had become more than a grateful father, he had become a friend. The Sheikh divided his time between his business interests in Dubai and an extended stay in Charleston, while Layla underwent follow-up treatments for her laryngeal papillomatosis. The condition was chronic, requiring repeated procedures to remove recurring papillomas, but with proper management, children typically outgrew it by adolescence. Rashid made sure Layla's care was coordinated through St. Catherine's specifically, so Marcus could be involved in her treatment planning. "You are part of her story," Rashid insisted. "You are part of our family's story. I want you to watch her grow up and know that you made that possible." The two men had fallen into an easy friendship, meeting for coffee before Marcus's shifts, sharing stories about their daughters, discussing the strange turns life could take when grief either destroyed you or transformed you into something new. It was during one of these coffee meetings that Rashid first mentioned his concern about Eleanor Hartwell, the 58-year-old director of St. Catherine's Pediatric Research Foundation. "She seems tired," Rashid observed, stirring sugar into his coffee. "More than tired, depleted. I see it in her eyes during our foundation meetings. She reminds me of how you looked when I first met you, Marcus, like someone who's been giving and giving until there's nothing left but doesn't know how to stop." Marcus knew Eleanor by sight, a tall, slender woman with silver blonde hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, always wearing elegant but understated suits, always moving with purpose through the hospital corridors. He'd heard she was a widow, that she'd founded the research foundation after her own son had died from a rare genetic condition, that she worked 70-hour weeks and hadn't taken a vacation in a decade. "What makes her your concern?" Marcus asked gently, recognizing something of himself in Rashid's protectiveness toward this woman he barely knew. "She's been instrumental in securing research funding for pediatric rare diseases," Rashid explained, "including additional funding for laryngeal papillomatosis research, partially at my request. But yesterday, during our quarterly foundation meeting, she nearly collapsed. She tried to play it off as just skipping lunch. But Marcus," he shook his head, "I know what burnout looks like. I know what it looks like when someone is using work to avoid facing their grief. She's destroying herself one committee meeting at a time, and everyone just accepts it because she's so good at what she does." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own decades of cleaning floors at night, avoiding daylight and people and the possibility of connection because it was easier to exist in the shadows than to risk his heart again. "Maybe," he said slowly, "she needs someone to remind her that she's more than her work, that she's allowed to be a person, not just a foundation director or a mother who lost her child." Rashid smiled knowingly. "You would be good at that conversation, I think. You understand what it means to lose a child. You understand what it means to let that loss define you for too long." Marcus felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in years, nervousness mixed with possibility. "I don't even know her, Rashid. I can't just walk up to the foundation director and start a conversation about grief and burnout." But even as he said it, he knew he was making excuses. The truth was, he'd noticed Eleanor too. He'd seen her in the pediatric ward, kneeling beside young patients with a gentleness that spoke of personal understanding. He'd seen her in the cafeteria late at night, eating a salad at her desk while reviewing grant proposals. He'd seen her pause once outside the NICU, watching the babies through the window with an expression of such profound sadness that he'd almost approached her then, almost said something, but had chickened out. "Life is short, my friend," Rashid said, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Too short to let chances for connection pass by because of fear. You taught me that, you know. When you risked your job to save Layla, you taught me that sometimes we have to step out of our safe designated roles and be brave enough to act when it matters." The opportunity came 2 weeks later when Marcus was working late on case documentation in the Pediatric Emergency Department's consultation office. It was nearly 9 p.m., and he was alone in the section of offices designated for research and administrative staff, or so he thought until he heard a sound from the office next door, a muffled sob, quickly stifled. He stood quietly, listening, torn between respecting privacy and concern for whoever was in distress. Another sob, and then the sound of someone trying to catch their breath. Marcus made his decision. He knocked gently on the connecting door. "Hello? Are you okay in there?" Silence. Then the sound of someone clearing their throat, composing themselves. "Yes, I'm fine, just working late." The voice was unmistakably Eleanor Hartwell's, and it was unmistakably not fine. Marcus hesitated, then spoke again. "I'm Marcus Wellington. I'm the new pediatric consultant. I know we haven't officially met, but I'm a good listener if you need one. No judgment, no obligation, just someone who understands what it's like to work late because going home feels harder." Architected, mature romance narrative with shared trauma and redemption themes. More silence, and then the door opened. Eleanor stood there, and Marcus was struck by how different she looked from her usual polished professional appearance. Her silver blonde hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she looked smaller, somehow more vulnerable, without her usual armor of efficiency and capability. "I'm sorry," she said, attempting a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You caught me at a weak moment. It's just today is the anniversary of my son's death. 8 years. And it still feels like yesterday." Marcus nodded, his heart aching with recognition. "I understand. My daughter died 30 years ago, and there are still days when the grief feels fresh enough to bleed. Would you like some? A company? I was about to make some terrible hospital coffee, but it's better than crying alone in an office." They ended up in the small staff kitchen adjacent to the consultation offices, sitting across from each other at a worn table with chipped formica surfaces, drinking coffee that was indeed terrible, but served its purpose as a reason to pause, to sit, to talk. Eleanor told Marcus about her son Thomas, who had died at age 12 from Duchenne muscular dystrophy, how she'd watched him gradually lose his ability to walk, to move, to breathe independently. "I promised him," she said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth, "that his life would matter, that I would make sure other children with rare diseases had better outcomes, better treatments, better hope than he had. That's why I founded the Research Foundation. But lately," she trailed off, looking lost. "Lately, I wonder if I'm keeping that promise, or if I'm just running from the fact that I couldn't save him, that no amount of research funding or foundation work will ever bring him back." Marcus recognized the raw honesty in her words, the kind of vulnerability that only comes when someone has held grief alone for so long that the weight of it finally breaks through polished surfaces. "I spent 30 years cleaning floors at night," he told her quietly, "deliberately taking a job where I wouldn't have to interact with people, wouldn't have to risk caring about anyone, wouldn't have to face the daylight hours that reminded me my daughter should have been growing up. I told myself I was doing something useful, keeping the hospital clean, maintaining safety standards, but the truth was, I was hiding. I was letting my grief turn me into a ghost." He met her eyes across the table. "The only reason I'm not still cleaning those floors, the only reason I have this new role that gives me purpose is because a baby girl nearly died and I couldn't stay silent anymore. Sometimes we need something to pull us out of our hiding places, whether we're hiding in night shift janitorial work or in 70-hour work weeks." Eleanor laughed, but it was tinged with tears. 70 hours? Try 90. I'm usually here by 6 a.m. and rarely leave before 10 p.m. Weekends too, my house. She shook her head. My house feels like a museum to Thomas. All his things are exactly where he left them. His room is unchanged. I eat cereal for dinner standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table alone feels too hard. I know it's not healthy. I know I'm stuck, but I don't know how to move forward without feeling like I'm leaving him behind. Marcus reached across the table and gently took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but he felt her startle at the contact, as if she'd forgotten what human touch felt like outside of professional handshakes. Moving forward doesn't mean leaving him behind, Marcus said softly. It means taking everything you learned from loving him and letting that inform how you live now. Thomas wouldn't want you destroying yourself. He'd want you to be happy. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories about their lost children, about the particular pain of parental grief, about the ways they'd both tried to bargain with God or fate or the universe to turn back time. Eleanor told Marcus about the last conversation she'd had with Thomas, how he'd made her promise not to be sad forever, how he'd told her with the wisdom of a child who'd faced his mortality too young that she was still allowed to have a life after he was gone. I haven't kept that promise, she whispered. I've been sad for 8 years, and I don't know how to stop. Marcus told her about Jasmine, about the guilt he'd carried for not recognizing her symptoms sooner, about how saving Layla had finally given him permission to forgive himself. I don't think the sadness ever completely goes away, he said, but I think it can coexist with other things, with joy, with purpose, with connection. I think we're allowed to honor our children's memories while also living fully. In fact, I think that's what they'd want most. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Eleanor developed a routine of meeting for coffee before Marcus's consultation shifts. What started as simple companionship between two people who understood each other's grief gradually deepened into something more. They discovered shared interests beyond their losses, a love of classical music, a passion for old movies, a mutual tendency to overthink everything. Eleanor began to cut back her hours slightly, accepting that the foundation would not collapse if she occasionally left at 6 p.m. instead of 10 p.m. Marcus helped her begin the painful process of sorting through Thomas's room, not to erase his memory, but to transform the shrine into something that honored him without keeping her trapped in the past. They worked together one Sunday afternoon, carefully packing away Thomas's clothes to donate to children in need, a decision Eleanor made because her son had been generous and would have approved, while keeping meaningful items. His favorite books, his collection of superhero figures, photographs that told the story of his life. Rashid watched the developing relationship with satisfaction, pleased that his intuition about these two wounded souls had been correct. Layla continued to thrive under the combined care of St. Catherine's medical team, with Marcus providing valuable input on her treatment plan and Eleanor securing additional research funding specifically for pediatric laryngeal papillomatosis. The baby girl was now 9 months old, bright-eyed and curious, already showing signs of the intelligence that ran in her father's family. Rashid often brought her to the hospital for her follow-up appointments, and she would light up when she saw Marcus reaching for him with chubby baby hands that had no memory of the night he'd saved her life, but seemed to recognize him as someone safe, someone important. She loves you, Rashid told Marcus during one such visit. You are her Amu, her uncle, in every way that matters. When she's old enough to understand, I will tell her what you did. I will make sure she knows that heroes don't always wear capes or carry medical degrees. But Marcus's new role was not without challenges. Not everyone at St. Catherine's was comfortable with the unprecedented nature of his position. Some physicians saw him as an overstepping janitor playing doctor. Others worried about liability issues. Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a senior attending in pediatric emergency medicine, was particularly vocal in her skepticism. It sets a dangerous precedent, she argued in a staff meeting. We're essentially validating the idea that anyone can provide medical consultation based on personal research and one lucky guess. What happens when he's wrong? What happens when a family sues because they took advice from someone without medical credentials? Dr. Morrison defended Marcus passionately, pointing out that he worked only under supervision, that his knowledge was highly specialized and specific rather than general, and that his input had already proven valuable in multiple cases. But the tension remained, an undercurrent of professional resistance to Marcus's unusual position in the hospital. Hierarchy. The situation came to a head when Marcus was consulted on a case involving a 2-year-old boy named Ethan with recurring respiratory infections. The attending physician, Dr. Thornton, had diagnosed him with severe asthma and prescribed an aggressive course of steroids and bronchodilators. Marcus reviewed the case file and felt a familiar unease. The pattern of infections, the specific locations of the lung involvement, the child's history of choking incidents in infancy, something didn't fit the asthma diagnosis. I think you should consider a bronchoscopy to rule out a foreign body aspiration, Marcus suggested carefully to Dr. Thornton. She looked at him with barely concealed irritation. I've been practicing pediatric emergency medicine for 15 years, Mr. Wellington. I know asthma when I see it. Not every respiratory issue is a rare condition. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and asthma is just asthma. Marcus tried again. I Understand, but the history includes a choking incident at 18 months, and the right lower lobe involvement is persistent despite treatment. It's worth ruling out. Dr. Thornton cut him off sharply. I'm not subjecting a child to an invasive procedure based on a janitor's hunch. Your success with one diagnosis doesn't make you qualified to question experienced physicians on every case. She turned to Ethan's mother, who had been listening to the exchange with growing confusion. Mrs. Patterson, I assure you we have the correct diagnosis. Your son has severe asthma, and we'll be admitting him for observation and medication adjustment. You don't need to worry about Mr. Wellington's suggestion. He means well, but he's not a doctor. The dismissal was clear and final. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and frustration. He knew he was right, knew it with the same certainty he'd felt with Layla, but he also knew he couldn't push further without overstepping his authority entirely. He left the consultation feeling defeated, wondering if Dr. Thornton was right, if he was becoming too confident, if his one success had gone to his head. Eleanor found him an hour later, sitting alone in the small chapel at the back of the hospital, a quiet space he'd discovered during his years as a janitor, where he could think without interruption. Rashid called me, she said, sliding into the pew beside him. He said you looked upset when you passed him in the hallway. What happened? Marcus told her about Ethan, about Dr. Thornton's dismissal, about his growing fear that maybe he didn't belong in this role after all. What if I'm wrong, Eleanor? What if Dr. Thornton is right, and I'm just seeing patterns that aren't there because I want so badly for my knowledge to matter? Eleanor took his hand, her touch now familiar and comforting. Or what if you're right, and a little boy is going to suffer unnecessarily because a doctor's pride got in the way of considering alternative possibilities? Marcus, you were right about Layla when everyone else was wrong. You've been right on 3 other cases in your first 3 months. You've earned the right to trust your instincts. But I'm not a doctor, Marcus said, echoing Dr. Thornton's words. Maybe that matters more than I want it to. Maybe formal education and credentials exist for a reason, and I'm just playing at something I'm not qualified to do. Eleanor squeezed his hand firmly. You know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who turned the worst thing that ever happened to him into expertise that saves lives. I see someone who was brave enough to speak up when speaking up could cost him everything. And I see someone who treats every single child like they're his own daughter, who reviews cases with the kind of attention and care that comes from understanding how precious and fragile life is. She paused, then added more, softly. I also see someone who's been alone for a very long time, who's forgotten what it's like to have someone believe in him. Well, I believe in you, Marcus Wellington. I believe in your knowledge, your instincts, and your heart. Don't let one dismissive doctor make you forget your value. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the foundation director or the grieving mother or the woman who'd been crying in her office that night, but Eleanor, smart, dedicated, beautiful Eleanor, who had somehow seen past his janitor's uniform to the person underneath, who had chosen to trust him with her grief and her friendship, and now with her belief in his worth. Thank you, he said quietly. And then, before he could overthink it or talk himself out of it, he leaned forward and kissed her gently. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and possibilities, of 2 people who had spent so long in the dark that they'd forgotten what light looked like, finding it in each other. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes, transforming her face with a joy that Marcus suspected had been absent for the entire 8 years since Thomas's death. I've wanted to do that for weeks, Marcus admitted, his heart racing. But I wasn't sure if you... Eleanor laughed, a sound he was learning to treasure. Marcus, I'm 58 years old, and I've been alone since my husband Richard died 2 years after Thomas. I'm too old for games and uncertainty. Yes, I'm interested. Yes, I've been thinking about you constantly. Yes, I would very much like to see where this might go. She kissed him again, more confidently this time. Now, what are we going to do about Ethan? Because I know you, and I know you're not going to be able to let this go if you truly believe that child is being misdiagnosed. Marcus felt something settle inside him, a combination of Eleanor's support and his own, renewed confidence in his instincts. "I'm going to talk to Rashid. He has influence with the hospital board. Maybe he can suggest they require a second opinion before admitting Ethan. That way, it's not me pushing back against Dr. Thornton directly. It's hospital policy ensuring thorough evaluation." Rashid listened to Marcus's explanation with the focused attention he brought to important business negotiations. They were sitting in Rashid's temporary office at the hotel where he was, staying during this extended period in Charleston, with Layla napping peacefully in her portable crib nearby. "This is delicate," Rashid said thoughtfully. "We don't want to create the impression that I'm using my financial influence to override medical decisions. That would be unethical and would ultimately undermine your position further." He tapped his fingers on his desk, thinking, "But what if we approach it differently? I'm on the hospital's board of directors. I could raise a general concern about diagnostic accuracy and patient safety, suggest implementing a protocol for second opinions on complex cases, particularly involving children. It would apply across the board, not just to Dr. Thornton's cases. That way, when Ethan's case goes for secondary review, it's simply following new protocol rather than a targeted response." The proposal went before the hospital board within a week, supported by Rashid's carefully presented data on diagnostic error rates and the value of collaborative consultation on complex pediatric cases. The protocol passed, requiring secondary physician review for any pediatric case involving admission and extended treatment. When Ethan Patterson's case came up for the required secondary review, the reviewing physician was Dr. Samuel Chen, the ENT surgeon who had worked with Marcus on Layla's case. Dr. Chen ordered a bronchoscopy, which revealed exactly what Marcus had suspected: a small plastic toy bead lodged in Ethan's right lower bronchus, likely aspirated during the choking incident 15 months earlier. The foreign body had been causing repeated infections and inflammation that mimicked asthma. Once removed, Ethan's respiratory problems resolved completely within 2 weeks. Mrs. Patterson specifically requested to thank Marcus, telling anyone who would listen that the janitor turned consultant had been the only person who truly listened to her concerns about her son's history. Dr. Thornton, to her credit, sought out Marcus privately after Ethan's successful outcome. She found him in his consultation office, reviewing case files. "May I come in?" she asked, and Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat down, and he could see the struggle playing out on her face, pride warring with professional integrity. "You were right about Ethan," she said finally. "I should have listened. I let my defensiveness about your unusual position cloud my clinical judgment. That's inexcusable." She met his eyes. "I owe you an apology, and more importantly, Ethan Patterson's family deserved better from me. You saved that child from months or years of inappropriate treatment and unnecessary suffering." Marcus felt the familiar weight of vindication mixed with sadness that it had required another child's near miss to prove his value. "Thank you for saying that, Dr. Thornton. I know my position here is unconventional. I know it makes people uncomfortable, but I'm not trying to play doctor or undermine anyone's authority. I'm just trying to make sure no child falls through the diagnostic cracks the way my daughter did." Dr. Thornton nodded slowly. "I've been reading about your daughter, about what happened to Jasmine. I can't imagine carrying that kind of loss and then transforming it into the kind of expertise you have. It's humbling." She stood up, extending her hand. "I hope we can work together better going forward. I think I have a lot to learn from you about humility and really listening, not just to patients and families, but to unconventional sources of knowledge." Marcus shook her hand, grateful for the olive branch. As she left, he reflected on how far he'd come from that night 3 months ago when he'd been just a janitor with a mop, invisible to everyone, existing in the shadows. Now he was building relationships, earning respect, and perhaps most surprisingly, opening his heart to the possibility of love again. His relationship with Eleanor deepened over the following months with the kind of gentle inevitability that comes when two people have lived long enough to know what matters. They didn't rush. Both had been burned by grief and loss. Both needed time to trust that happiness was something they were still allowed to have. Their first official date was to a Charleston Symphony Orchestra concert, followed by dinner at a quiet restaurant where they talked for hours, discovering new layers to each other. Eleanor told him about her late husband Richard, a high school English teacher who had been Thomas's biggest advocate, fighting for accommodations and understanding from a school system that didn't always know how to support a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Richard died of a heart attack 2 years after Thomas, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with old pain. The doctors said it was genetic, unrelated to the stress of Thomas's illness and death, but I've always wondered if grief can literally break your heart. Marcus shared more about his own marriage to Denise, how they'd met in college and built a life together that seemed perfect until Jasmine's death revealed cracks neither of them had known existed. Denise needed me to be strong, to be the one who kept it together while she fell apart, Marcus said. But I was falling apart too. We just fell in different directions until we couldn't reach each other anymore. The divorce was finalized about 5 years after Jasmine died. She remarried eventually, moved to Oregon. I heard she has stepchildren now. I hope she's happy. I hope she found the peace I couldn't give her. Eleanor reached across the table, taking both his hands in hers. Maybe we both needed all those years of grief and solitude to become people who could appreciate this. Appreciate finding someone who understands loss, who doesn't expect us to be healed or over it, who knows that loving again doesn't mean forgetting who we lost. Their relationship became public knowledge at the hospital when they arrived together one morning, Eleanor's hand naturally finding Marcus's as they walked through the main entrance. By noon, the hospital grapevine had spread the news that the pediatric consultant and the foundation director were a couple. Most people reacted with warmth. Both Marcus and Eleanor were well liked, and their shared history of loss and their individual dedication to pediatric welfare made them a sympathetic pair. But there were whispers too, particularly from older staff members who remembered Marcus as the janitor and questioned whether the relationship was appropriate, whether Eleanor was lowering herself, whether Marcus was overreaching his position. Eleanor addressed those whispers head-on at the next foundation board meeting, her voice clear and firm. I've become aware that some people have concerns about my relationship with Marcus Wellington. Let me be very clear. Marcus is a brilliant, dedicated professional who has earned his position through expertise and proven results. He is also a kind, thoughtful man who has helped me rediscover what it means to live rather than just exist. Our relationship is nobody's business but ours, and it in no way compromises my work for this foundation or his work as a consultant. Rashid had become a regular presence at Marcus and Eleanor's gatherings, often bringing Layla to Eleanor's house for Sunday afternoon visits that felt like family. The Sheikh had completed his primary business in Charleston, but had decided to extend his stay indefinitely, finding something in this southern city and its medical community that called to him. His wife, Samira, had finally traveled from Dubai to join him, and the couple's joy in their daughter's continued health was evident in every interaction. You gave us back our world, Samira told Marcus. During one of these Sunday visits, her accent a melodic blend of Arabic and British English from her education in London. Layla is thriving. She will need continued treatment as she grows, yes, but she is alive and laughing and exploring her world. This is because you were brave enough to speak. How does one thank someone for such a gift? Marcus was uncomfortable with excessive gratitude, but over time he'd learned to accept that for Rashid and Samira, expressing their thankfulness was important to their own healing. Watch her grow up happy, he said simply. That's all the thanks I need. Every time I see her smile, I think about my Jasmine, and I know that somehow, in some way, my daughter's death had meaning. It prepared me to save Layla. That doesn't erase the pain of losing Jasmine, but it makes it bearable. Little Layla, now nearly a year old, was pulling herself up to stand, babbling in that universal baby language that could mean anything or nothing, reaching for Marcus's face with sticky fingers that had just been exploring a graham cracker. Marcus lifted her onto his lap, his heart full of an emotion he'd thought he'd never feel again. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Peace, maybe. The sense that his life had purpose, beyond just surviving. Eleanor watched Marcus with Layla, seeing the gentleness in his hands, the way he instinctively supported the baby's wobbly attempts to stand, the softness in his eyes when he looked at her. She imagined him as a young father holding Jasmine before grief had carved lines into his face and bent his shoulders with weight invisible to those who didn't know his story. "You would have been a wonderful grandfather," she said softly, and Marcus nodded, understanding the unspoken acknowledgement of all the milestones he'd missed with Jasmine. First words, first steps, kindergarten, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, all the futures that had died with his daughter. "I think about that sometimes," he admitted, "about the life Jasmine would have had. But then I think about Layla and Ethan and the other children I've been able to help, and I wonder if maybe this is what I was meant to do. Maybe Jasmine's brief life and my long grief were preparing me for this work." Rashid, overhearing this, set down his coffee cup with the kind of deliberate motion that indicated he was about to say something important. "Marcus, I have been thinking about something for many weeks, and I would like to discuss it with you and Eleanor both." He waited until he had their full attention. "The work you do here at St. Catherine's is valuable, but it is limited in scope. You consult on cases that come through this one hospital. Meanwhile, there are pediatric emergency departments across this country, across the world, where rare conditions go undiagnosed because attending physicians don't have access to specialists or consultants with deep knowledge of uncommon presentations." He leaned forward. "I want to fund a national network, the Rare Pediatric Conditions Consultation Network. It would connect pediatric emergency departments with specialists and expert consultants who have deep knowledge of specific conditions. Doctors could call in for real-time consultation when they encounter cases that don't fit common patterns. You would be one of the founding consultants, Marcus. Your expertise in laryngeal papillomatosis and related respiratory conditions would be available to emergency departments nationwide." The idea was staggering in its ambition and potential impact. Eleanor immediately saw the possibilities from a foundation perspective. "We could partner with existing telemedicine platforms, create a database of rare condition specialists, develop consultation protocols that protect both the consulting experts and the attending physicians from liability issues." Her mind was already racing with implementation strategies. "The foundation could provide initial funding for the infrastructure, and we could seek NIH grants for ongoing operational support. Rashid, this could genuinely change pediatric emergency care." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Rashid was proposing. "I'm just one person with knowledge about one condition," he protested. "How can I?" Rashid interrupted gently. "You are one person who transformed personal tragedy into expertise that has already saved multiple lives. But you're right, this network would need many consultants with various areas of expertise. You would help us recruit them, train them in consultation protocols, and serve as a model for how lived experience combined with intensive self-directed learning can be valuable in medical contexts." Over the following months, the Rare Pediatric Conditions Consultation Network began to take shape. Eleanor leveraged her foundation connections to bring in pediatric specialists, parent advocates whose children had died from misdiagnosed rare conditions, and even other individuals like Marcus, people who had transformed personal loss into deep expertise. They created consultation protocols, developed a secure telemedicine platform, established relationships with pediatric emergency departments across the country. Marcus found himself traveling for the first time in years, speaking at conferences, training other consultants, sharing his story and his knowledge with audiences who ranged from skeptical to enthusiastically supportive. Eleanor often traveled with him, providing foundation expertise and, more importantly, providing the emotional support that came from someone who understood his journey and believed absolutely in his value. Their relationship evolved from tentative new beginnings to something solid and enduring. Marcus sold his small apartment and moved into Eleanor's house, the same house where Thomas had grown up. which Eleanor had finally transformed from a shrine into a living space that honored her son's memory without being trapped by it. They filled the house with new memories, dinner parties with colleagues, quiet evenings reading side by side, laughter that had been absent from those walls for too long. Marcus helped Eleanor finally scatter Richard's ashes in the marsh where he'd loved to kayak, a ritual she'd been unable to face alone for years. Eleanor stood beside Marcus at the cemetery on the anniversary of Jasmine's death, laying flowers on a grave he hadn't visited in 2 decades, giving him permission to grieve publicly rather than alone in the shadows. When Marcus proposed, it was not with a dramatic gesture, but with simple honesty on an ordinary Tuesday evening while they were washing dishes together. "I don't want to live without you anymore," he said, his hands soapy from the dinner plates, his heart full of certainty. "I want to build a life together. Whatever years we have left, I want to spend them with you. Will you marry me, Eleanor?" She turned to him, her own hands wet, and kissed him softly. "Yes, absolutely yes. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know that I'm not alone anymore, that we get to face whatever comes next together." They married in a small ceremony at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Charleston, with Rashid and Samira as witnesses, little Layla as an honorary flower girl. She mostly ate flowers, but the intent was there, and a gathering of friends and colleagues who had watched 2 broken people find each other and become whole. The Rare Pediatric Conditions Consultation Network launched officially 1 year after the night Marcus had saved Layla's life. The opening ceremony, held at St. Catherine's Medical Center, drew pediatric specialists, hospital administrators, and media attention from across the country. Marcus stood at the podium in a suit that still felt foreign after decades, of janitor's uniforms and consultation coats, looking out at the crowd, seeing Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen and even Dr. Thornton, seeing hospital staff who had once dismissed him as just a janitor, seeing Rashid and Samira with Layla, now a healthy, vibrant toddler taking her first steps. 3 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I was a hospital janitor who nobody noticed. I spent my nights cleaning floors and my days sleeping in an apartment that felt more like a storage unit than a home. I had given up on the idea that my life could be anything more than a daily routine of work and solitude, punctuated by grief so old it had become familiar. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then a baby girl nearly died, and I had a choice. I could stay silent, stay in my designated role, maintain the boundaries society had established for who I was and what I was allowed to do. Or I could risk everything, my job, my dignity, my carefully constructed, invisible existence, on the possibility that my knowledge mattered, that my daughter's death could mean something, that I could save a life even though I couldn't save hers. His eyes found Eleanor in the crowd, drawing strength from her steady presence. I spoke up, and that one moment of courage changed everything. It gave me back my purpose. It connected me with people who became family, Rashid and Samira Al-Mahmoud, who treated me with dignity when I was still just a janitor, who saw my knowledge and my worth when others saw only my uniform. It introduced me to my incredible wife, Eleanor, who reminds me every day that it's never too late to start over, to choose hope, to believe that we deserve happiness, even after loss. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued, but this network isn't about me or my story. It's about every child who presents with symptoms that don't fit the textbook patterns. It's about every parent who knows something is wrong with their baby but can't get doctors to listen. It's about every physician who encounters a rare condition once or twice in an entire career and doesn't have the specialized knowledge to recognize it immediately. This network connects expertise with need. It creates a system where no child should die of a misdiagnosed rare condition because the right knowledge exists somewhere. We just need to connect the dots faster. He gestured to the screen behind him, which showed the network's interface and the initial roster of specialist consultants. We have 37 expert consultants representing knowledge in over 60 rare pediatric conditions. conditions. Some are physicians with specialized training. Some are researchers who have dedicated their careers to specific diseases. And some, like me, are parents who transformed personal tragedy into expertise through years of intensive study and lived experience. All of them are available 24/7 to consult with pediatric emergency departments facing complex cases. The impact of the Rare Pediatric Conditions Consultation Network was immediate and profound. Within the first 6 months, the network received over 200 consultation requests from pediatric emergency departments across the United States. 14 of those consultations resulted in changed diagnoses that likely prevented serious complications or death. One case involved a 7-month-old with laryngeal papillomatosis in Seattle, diagnosed based on Marcus's remote consultation and successfully treated. Another involved a rare genetic disorder called Menkes disease, identified by a parent advocate consultant whose own son had died from the condition before it was diagnosed. The stories multiplied, children saved, families spared the anguish of preventable loss, physicians grateful for access to specialized knowledge that didn't exist within their own hospitals. Marcus's life had transformed so completely that sometimes he had to stop and remind himself this was real, that he had gone from invisible to visible, from isolated to surrounded by people who valued him, from merely surviving to actually living. His work with the consultation network took him across the country several times a month, training new consultants, speaking at conferences, consulting on complex cases. But he always came home to Charleston, to Eleanor, to the life they had built together in a house that held both their pasts and their present. They had converted Thomas's old room into a home office where Eleanor managed her foundation work and Marcus prepared his case reviews. The superhero figures Thomas had loved were displayed on a shelf alongside framed photos of Jasmine, 2 children who had died too young, whose memories were now honored not through frozen shrines, but through the lives their parents had dedicated to preventing other children from suffering similar fates. Rashid and Samira had made Charleston their primary home, with Rashid managing his business interests remotely and making regular trips back to Dubai as needed. Layla was now 3 years old, a bright, energetic child who showed no lasting effects from her near-death experience as an infant. The papillomas in her throat still occasionally required removal. Laryngeal papillomatosis was a chronic condition, but she was growing up healthy and happy, surrounded by love and the best medical care available. She called Marcus Uncle Marcus and Eleanor Auntie Ellie, and she had recently started asking why her Uncle Marcus was on television. A news segment about the consultation network had featured him prominently. "When I'm bigger," she announced with the absolute confidence of a preschooler, "I'm going to be a doctor like Uncle Marcus and help babies like me." Rashid and Marcus had exchanged amused glances. Marcus wasn't technically a doctor, but the title seemed less important than the work. And who were they to discourage a 3-year-old's ambitious career plans? The friendship between Marcus, Eleanor, and the Al-Mahmoud family had deepened into something that transcended gratitude or professional collaboration. They were simply family now, chosen family, built not through blood but through shared experience, mutual respect, and genuine affection. They gathered for Sunday dinners, celebrated holidays together, marked the anniversaries of loss with ceremonies that honored those who were gone, while affirming their commitment to living fully. Samira and Eleanor had become close friends, bonding over their experiences as mothers who had faced their children's medical crises, as women navigating the challenges of international marriage and cross-cultural families. Rashid had expanded his philanthropic work to include not just the consultation network, but also substantial funding for pediatric rare disease research, scholarships for children from low-income families who wanted to pursue medicine, and programs supporting hospital staff in underfunded facilities. One evening, as Marcus and Eleanor sat on their back porch watching the sunset paint Charleston's sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor said quietly, "Do you ever think about what our lives would look like if that night had gone differently, if you hadn't spoken up, if the doctors had dismissed you entirely?" Marcus considered the question, his hand finding hers naturally, comfortably. "I think about it," he admitted. I think about how close I came to staying silent, to letting fear keep me from acting. And I think about all the ways my life would still be small and dark and lonely if I had made that choice. He squeezed her hand. I wouldn't have this work that gives me purpose. I wouldn't have Rashid and Samira's friendship. I wouldn't have you. I would still be cleaning floors at night and sleeping through days, existing but not really living. We would have found each other eventually, Eleanor said with certainty. Maybe not that night in my office, but somehow, I believe that. Two people who are meant to be together find their way to each other. Marcus smiled at her optimism, which he'd learned to trust even when his own natural inclination was toward pragmatism. Maybe, or maybe we both needed that night to shake us out of our separate griefs. Maybe we needed me to save Layla before we could be people who were ready to save each other. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of their neighborhood, children playing in yards, the distant sounds of traffic, the gentle rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. Marcus thought about the 22-year-old EMT he had been when Jasmine was born, full of confidence and certainty about how his life would unfold. He thought about the 32-year-old man whose world had shattered when his daughter died. He thought about the lonely, hollow person who had spent 3 decades hiding from life, from connection, from the possibility of hurt or happiness. And he thought about who he was now, at 65, a man who had learned that expertise and value could come from the most unexpected places, that it was never too late to start over, that love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances. The consultation network continued to grow and evolve, with new specialist consultants joining regularly, new partnerships forming with pediatric emergency departments worldwide, new technologies improving the speed and accuracy of remote consultations. Marcus received dozens of thank you letters from families whose children had been saved because of the network's interventions, each one a reminder that Jasmine's brief life had created ripples that touched people she would never meet. Eleanor's foundation secured a major NIH grant to fund research specifically focused on developing better diagnostic tools for rare pediatric conditions, work that Marcus contributed to from his unique perspective of someone who understood both the medical complexity and the devastating human impact of misdiagnosis. Together, they were making a difference that extended far beyond that one night in Trauma Bay 3, far beyond one baby girl's life. Though Layla remained the heart of everything they did, the proof that speaking up mattered, that courage and knowledge could overcome even the most dire circumstances. Layla's 4th birthday, the Al-Mahmoud family hosted a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by that night 4 years ago. Dr. Morrison brought her family, acknowledging that the experience had made her a better physician, more humble and more willing to listen to unconventional sources of knowledge. Dr. Chen and his wife attended, bringing a gift for Layla and sharing the news that they had just published a research paper on pediatric laryngeal papillomatosis that cited Marcus's case reviews as valuable clinical insights. Even Dr. Thornton came, having become one of Marcus's strongest professional allies and an advocate for the consultation network at medical conferences nationwide. Layla wore a princess dress and a plastic stethoscope, telling everyone that she was a doctor princess who would fix all the babies when she grew up. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Rashid pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. "My friend," Rashid said, his hand on Marcus's shoulder in the familiar gesture of brotherhood they had developed over the years, "I want you to know that saving Layla's life was just the beginning. You saved my family, yes, but you also saved yourself. You took your grief and your knowledge and your courage, and you built something that will outlast all of us. When we are gone, when Layla is grown with children of her own, the network you helped create will still be saving lives. That is a legacy that makes you more than a consultant, more than an expert. It makes you a healer in the truest sense." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, still unaccustomed even after 4 years to being seen, valued, celebrated for who he was, rather than dismissed for who he wasn't. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for believing in me when I was just a janitor with a mop, for treating me like I mattered before anyone else could see it, for becoming the family I didn't. No, I still needed. Eleanor joined them, sliding her arm around Marcus's waist, and together the three of them looked across the yard where Layla was playing with other children, her laugh bright and carefree, her future stretching ahead of her full of possibilities that had almost been stolen 4 years ago. "She will know," Samira said, joining their small circle, her elegant hijab perfectly coordinated with her contemporary dress. "When she is old enough to truly understand, we will tell her the story of the night she almost died and the man who saved her. We will make sure she knows that heroes come in many forms, that wisdom exists in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to the person everyone else is ignoring." She looked at Marcus with affection and gratitude. "You are her guardian angel, Marcus. You are why I still have my daughter. I will be grateful for that every day for the rest of my life." As the sun set on Layla's 4th birthday party, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from devastating loss to lonely exile to unexpected redemption. He thought about how one decision to speak up, to risk everything on the belief that his knowledge mattered, had transformed not just his life, but the lives of countless others. He looked at Eleanor, who had emerged from her own grief to find love and purpose again. He looked at Rashid and Samira, who had turned their gratitude into action that was changing pediatric emergency care worldwide. He looked at little Layla, who would grow up not knowing how close she had come to death, who would live a full life filled with all the moments: school, friends, first love, career, maybe someday children of her own that Jasmine had never experienced. And Marcus understood, perhaps for the first time since Jasmine's death 34 years ago, that loss and pain could be transformed into something meaningful, that grief could coexist with joy, and that it was never, ever too late to begin again. The scars remained, they always would, but now they were proof of survival, evidence of resilience, the foundation on which a new life had been built. Marcus was no longer just a father who had lost his daughter or a janitor who cleaned floors in the night. He was a healer, a teacher, a husband, a friend, a man who had learned that the most unlikely people can save lives, that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the world is born from our deepest pain.